So the next section that we're going to go through is some of the adaptations to the sex therapy concepts in order to better position diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So I'm gonna first show a video that discusses diversity in an interesting way. Then we're going to talk about sexual rights. And then I have 5 therapeutic techniques to discuss around adapting sex therapy concepts so that they are more inclusive and inclusive of diverse voices. So let's start with this, this first video. It comes from Denmark, and it was an advertisement. And when I saw it, I just loved it, and I thought it was a really good way to set up talking about diversity issues.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. Bisexual, and we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life, and we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think.
So what that video is really speaking to is the intersectionality of identities, and how in some parts of society, the way that we construct our identities is very informed by what is in the larger culture, which could be through religion, government, traditional policies. That we might be viewing people through a lens of male, female, gay, straight. And those identities that we have intersect with all of our other identities that we carry with us as a step parent, as a class clown. And we are so much more than even our sexual identities. And yet sometimes those sexual identities are the ones that are discussed overly so or overly emphasized in society. So I'm going to talk about horizontalizing in a minute of one of the techniques that we can use to help people appreciate the intersections of their identity. The next concept here is on sexual rights. So in 2013, it was the World Association for Sexual Health, and they got together and made a declaration of sexual rights. And with that, they really were stating that sexual diversity required some protection. So some statements that recognized sexual diversity. In Canada here, CCAN, which is the Canadian group around sex education, they released their guidelines in 2018 for sexual health education, and they affirmed similar principles to the World Association for Sexual Health, Sexual Rights declaration here. So I want to just talk about a couple of examples that are in the Declaration of Sexual Rights, because this is something that I think is important actually to bring in to a therapeutic context with clients, talking about sexual rights, sexual health values, and then being able to construct their sexuality with these rights and values top of mind. So, for example, some of them are sexual rights are human rights, and the right to equality and non-discrimination. The right to be entitled to enjoy all kinds of sexual rights that are set forth in this declaration, without distinguishing race, ethnicity, color, religion, any other variables. So everyone has the right to security that cannot be arbitrarily threatened, limited, or taken away for reasons related to sexuality. So sexual orientation, consensual sexual behavior and practices, that we have a right as humans to have our sexuality not infringe upon the rest of our human rights. A couple of important ones too that I want to draw attention to: the right to autonomy and bodily integrity, so that everyone has the right to control and decide freely on matters relating to their sexuality and their body. And we can see with some of what we've already talked about in terms of patriarchy and some of those influences, is that the right to autonomy and bodily integrity for sexuality is not something we can take for granted in our society, even though we might look at this and intellectually say, yes, of course, everybody has that right. In practice, and sometimes even with couples, these rights are not being honored in their relationship dynamics. And that might be very important to discuss as a sexual right, and that being part of how you're helping the clients construct what their sexuality might look like, if it's going to be different or maybe more sustainable. Another one is the right to be free from any cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment because of any aspect of someone's sexuality. So in the past, this has been exercised through sterilization, contraception, abortion, different rights that the culture will have set up at different times, that well, different rights, different laws, I guess, that may infringe actually on an individual's sexual rights. If anybody's following some of the political landscape in the United States, especially in Texas and Florida right now, Florida has a bill that they've called "Don't Say Gay" bill. That's what they've termed. Some elements of that bill in Texas, the laws seem to be going after the right to provide gender affirmative care for gender dysphoric children. So some of these issues are beyond our offices, and it is important to remember that we are living in a society, or we may be living in a certain part of society that does not respect sexual rights in the same way that other parts of society or other areas or communities might. And so we don't want to assume with our clients that they have been given sexual rights, or that they have learned about their sexual rights, or that they even know that they have a right to certain sexuality, or making decisions about their autonomy and what they want to have happen with their body. So to spend a little bit more time on these adaptations, we want to kind of throw a few questions out to kind of keep our minds open, have flexible thinking, watching for our biases to sneak in, which are easy to do based on traditional sex therapy concepts, because they do have a lot of the medical model and patriarchy infused into their conception of the problems. So is intercourse the defining characteristic of sex for everyone? So we talked about that before. We need to know, maybe in different cultures, intercourse is emphasized differently than other aspects of sexuality. And so we need to be aware of the cultural impact on where people are coming up with their ideas about what sex is, or what good sex might mean. So the definition of hypersexuality or sex addiction, is that the same for everybody? Well, I've mentioned 4 different categories that have been proposed really over time. Hypersexuality was proposed to get into the DSM-5, and it didn't quite make the cut. Sex addiction is not in the DSM. Compulsive sexual behaviors is in the International Classification of Diseases, which for some professionals means that sex addiction principles are not too far behind in terms of their inclusion in those diagnostics. For others, it means no, sex addiction will never be included in that. But it might be a compulsive sexual behavior that we might have diagnoses around. So does everybody go by the DSM to assess sexual functioning? No, certainly most people don't even know what the DSM says about their sexual functioning. So we might want to talk about how they've learned what does sexual functioning mean, or what does sexual dysfunction mean? And where did they learn that? Are they learning it from a medical model? Have they learned it from elsewhere? Or culturally, there might be differences in terms of agreement with the DSM, or agreement with the medical model in overall. Are all clients' goals the same? No, for sure. In my experience, I think that I have a certain set of goals for clients around sustainability, perspective taking, and flexibility, that a lot of times clients are asking for more practical solutions. They don't want to talk as much about it, which is partly due to the sex negativity in our culture. But they might not want to go very in depth in terms of the emotional or psychological components, and that might be okay. That might be culturally informed for them in terms of what does a positive outcome actually look like at the end of it. So what about sex therapy for solitary sex? So I see individuals, and we are talking about masturbation, or we are talking about other forms of independent sexuality, and they still want to nurture that kind of sex life for themselves, and it might not be in a relational dynamic. or there might even be an element of asexuality or gray sexuality that's a part of that they might want to understand, and we might really want to normalize for them as being, totally okay, not pathological in any way. So what role has trauma or mental illness played in sexual development, as well as even just, what are some of the cultural differences about the understanding of trauma or what trauma means? I know sometimes in terms of trauma with other cultures, we might talk a lot about spirituality. We might talk about how their religious framework might help them make sense of what has happened, and that can be different for lots of different individuals. And the role of society's non-acceptance of diverse sexualities. So really making sure that we pay attention to, and I talked about it with the DSM problems, that how many of those problems are really a result of the distress that's caused by society not accepting a certain part of an individual's sexuality, or the perception that society would not accept that part of them. And does that mean that it's actually an issue for them, or is this society's problem? But nevertheless, we really need to help our clients integrate some of that understanding so that they can feel safe in the world and understand a bit more about what this really means for them. So our 5 therapeutic techniques. So this is coming from an empirical study from a few years ago on what sex therapists use to adapt their sex therapy concepts for diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So what they came up with was that there were 3 principles. Before we get into the therapeutic techniques, they had 3 principles that were essential. One was a non-judgmental acceptance of their clients, training and experience with sexual diversity, and a social constructionist approach. So if you're not familiar with social constructionism, it's the theory that people develop knowledge of the world only in a social context, so that much of what we perceive as reality depends on our shared assumptions between people. From a social constructionist perspective, many of the things that we take for granted and we think are objective reality are actually socially constructed. And so they can change as society changes. The 5 techniques that emerged out of that data that they collected was in order to help sex therapists integrate sex therapy concepts into inclusive practice, we need to normalize. So normalization is, this issue is really more common than people talk about. There's nothing wrong with you for experiencing this problem. Maybe even, provide some statistics to help them feel like they're not alone. Horizontalizing. So this is where, we would try to expand an individual's idea of their sexuality and how that intersects with the rest of their life and who they are and what they do. So we want to understand all of the phenomenon at the same level, so all of the identities that an individual has at the same level, not prioritizing or having different levels of identities. So if someone wants to talk about their sexual identity, and let's say that it's about sexual orientation, we would want to broaden that discussion into, what does that mean about this other aspect of your identity? Does sexual orientation have any interaction with your gender identity or your gender expression? How do all of the different aspects of your identity work together and interact? Not just the sexual matters. We don't want clients to get too hyper focused and lose sight of the perspective of the rest of their identities within them as well. Affirmation being the third technique. So really affirming whatever the client's identity and a subjective experience is, without, trying to judge any of that, without contradicting it. Our clients are the ones who are the experts on their subjective experience. Our job is to try and help them express that experience and organize it in a way that helps them understand themselves and others better. The next technique is reflective practice. So this is now really on the therapist and what the therapist does outside of the sessions. We need to reflect on, why did I do what I did there with that client? How did I make that choice to go there, or to start talking about this, or to not talk about what the client seemed to want to talk about there? Is there anything that I would do differently next time? So reflective practice, as many may know, is associated with much better outcomes in terms of therapy and counseling processes. So it's no different when it comes to sex therapy. Perhaps even more vital at times, because of how easy it is for our sexual biases to come into play without us even noticing it. And so a reflective practice will help us make sure that we're paying attention to what we're doing. And then a non-pathologizing attitude is the last technique. And we've already talked a bit about how the medical model has some pathologizing nature in it. And we're not here to tell clients that what they are doing is wrong and that they have to do something different. We are not going to assume that there's any pathology. We are going to look at it as, how did this come to be? How did you learn and adapt from what you were given to be thinking and feeling and doing what you're doing right now? So how does that make sense? One of the things that I say to clients a lot is, this doesn't totally make sense right now, but I'm sure that there's a really good reason why you're doing this, and we just don't know yet. We don't totally understand the functionality of it, or maybe what that mechanism is trying to resolve in terms of maybe safety or security, feeling loved. So we really want to take a non-pathologizing attitude, which can be difficult when professionals are working from a sex addiction or porn addiction kind of model, because there's some pathology that's implied around pornography or deviant practices. So that can be tricky to make sure that if you're working in those kind of models, that you're not pathologizing what clients are doing. It makes sense to them. It makes sense. It's functional in some kind of level. We're not saying that they're bad just because of some behavior that they're doing, unless obviously it's like an offender. Obviously that becomes quite different. So those are 5 therapeutic techniques then that we can use to make sure that we're honoring and respecting diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of our sex therapy practice. The reflective practice also, I think, is really important around, are we matching our sex therapy concepts with cultural appropriateness? How do we need to modify it to make sure that we're not missing something that might be a very big factor because we're only looking at it from a certain kind of lens? or an old medical model or a patriarchal lens with it. So that reflective practice, so very important as a sex therapist or any individual who wants to help with sexual health.